This is Liverpool, home to Britain's kindest, most welcoming people, and myself, a grumpy German. Now, if you've ever been to Liverpool, you're probably familiar with the city's, rich history? No, older than that. No, much, much older than that. Liverpool has a, let's say, checkered past that links it firmly to the exploits of the colonial age. This is the Albert Dock. What is now a glamorous tourist trap with overpriced restaurants used to be part of Britain's most significant and largest port in the transatlantic's, triangular trade. The docks enabled mass storage and turnover of, well, whatever was innocently traded back in, Check's notes, the 1800s, like sugar, tobacco, cotton. For all intents and purposes, the port of Liverpool was the colonial trading hub of the 19th century. From here, ships would depart to explore the New World, to further expand the British Empire into the American and African continents, all to finally exploit their exotic resources and, if necessary, exterminate all native resistance. Now, if that to-do list sounds at all familiar to you, it's because tens of thousands of people engage in it every day while playing a video game that is very dear to my heart. So let me take you on a journey from civilization to a brave new world. Hi, we have cartoon characters now to raise our viewers' emotional investment and because we thought it might be cute. Before we dive straight into the topic though, I must establish something that I'm sure most of you are fully aware of, but some may not yet be, and it is this. Game studies is an interdisciplinary field that consists of many different branches, but ours is that of the humanities, which applies critical approaches like feminist or post-colonial readings to video games. This means that all that we do here is to determine what ideology a game communicates. That's it. Let me list two things that we don't do. Number one, we do not assign blame. Our goal is not to deduce the developer's intended meaning, but the game's actual conveyed meaning. We don't really care about the developers at all, actually. We only look at the game itself and maybe the ways in which it is advertised, but since we don't determine actual intent, we also can't assign blame. We're not psychologists, we don't care about people. People are boring. We care about media. Number two, we usually do not propose alternatives. Every piece of art carries ideological meaning, even if that ideology seems like common sense to you. That common sense is not universal and therefore an ideology. Our job is done once we feel like we've determined a game's communicated ideology. We usually don't propose ways in which it could have been designed differently. We might imply it, but it's not our forte and it's not the point of the humanities. We're not game designers or even game critics. Our goal is not to make games more fun or to determine whether a game is worth playing. It is to examine how a game represents and is shaped by the culture that produced it. Actually, I can guarantee you that most, if not all of the games we analyze in our videos are dear to our hearts. If you genuinely believe we have dedicated the majority of our lives to analyzing video games because we hate video games, then I'm sorry. Truly, I'm sorry for deceiving you. We had hoped that no one would notice, but you got us. Screw video games, they're a waste of time. Anyway, here's a 2-hour video loosely based on my 90-page master thesis that took me over 6 months of nothing but research and writing. I hope you hate it too. Oh, also, I may come off a little preachy at times because, for the sake of brevity, I had to cut a lot of examples. If you want to read more on this, I would direct you to my sources, especially the writings of Suvik Mukherjee, Simon Dorr, Mark James Carpenter, and Dom Ford. Oh, and just to avoid any confusion, I use the generic she to refer to the player because, well, because. Let's go! Great segue. Released all the way back in 2010, Civilization V has garnered a reputation as one of the most famous video games in the strategy genre. Back in 2018, when I wrote my original thesis, it was actually still the most popular strategy game in the world. But even 12 years after release, it still accrues almost 20,000 concurrent players at any given time, and on Steam, it still holds 4th place in the strategy genre, dethroned by, you guessed it, Civilization VI. Due to the game's mass appeal and its representation of culture and history, game studies quickly deemed the Civilization series as culturally significant and thus in dire need of study. There is a proliferation of scholarship that surrounds the series, much of which refers to its popularity as the quote-unquote pinnacle of turn-based strategy games, and Civ 5 in particular as one of the most successful and definitive works in its genre. And yet, a dedicated, comprehensive analysis of the game is really hard to find, because for some reason, strategy is still sort of a blind spot in game studies. According to Simon Dorr, professor in game studies at the University of Quebec, it is the complexity that has kept many researchers from analyzing strategy games in greater detail simply because it just takes so much time to fully grasp them. And even once you do, the sheer amount of data is just overwhelming. How do you analyze a genre this unwieldy? And how can you extract any ideology out of it? Well, to answer this, we can look at how a game even communicates ideology in the first place. And the modern consensus is that any game conveys meaning in 2 ways simultaneously. 1, in the way it presents itself, and 2, in the way that it functions. In ye olden days, this resulted in game studies being split up into 2 opposing camps: the narratologists, who stripped the game of all its mechanics and then analyzed the sad remains, and the ludologists, who discarded everything but the mechanics, spat out a bunch of 1s and 0s, and then went back to sleep mode. Fortunately, this era was short-lived. Both approaches turned out to be heavily interdependent and their divide overblown. According to Norwegian researcher Espen Aarseth, ludology has been erroneously contrasted with narratology, but since the ludologists all used narrative theory in their approaches to games, this juxtaposition is misinformed. It is impossible for ludology to discuss, for example, a goal without framing it as desirable, but why it is desirable can only be determined by narratology.
You have destroyed all that I was meant to rule.
Likewise, narratology cannot discuss the narrative of a game without examining player agency, which determines the different paths it can take. Both approaches can only work in conjunction. This is important because it lays bare the dogmatically ludologist understanding with which the earliest research on the Civilization series was conducted, such as that by David Myers in the early 2000s, who claimed that the series' mechanics were designed solely to support its reward system, which is why any ideological messaging must be coincidental and therefore irrelevant. Mark Hayes summarizes this old approach as the idea that any supposed cultural significance of the Civilization series takes a backseat to its ludic or game-like qualities, making the entirety of Myers' research practically useless. You've heard this argument before. It's just a game. Anything that it does only to entertain the player, so you can only analyze it on the merits of that purpose.
It's only a game.
That is, of course, farcical. If you limit your research to how a game's mechanics entertain its players, you're no longer conducting research about how art produces meaning, You're reviewing the game. Myers and his contemporary ludologists made a big fuss about how players claim not to care about the imperialist art design that surrounds the mechanics of the game, but for one, they fail to realize that the mechanics themselves carry meaning, and second of all, who cares? Your job should be to determine what ideas and values a game conveys, not how successfully those values reach the player's brain. It's important to note that Myers' research was already a response to narratologists of the time, such as Kaspar Pawlowski, who were already pointing out the series' obvious imperialism. 20 years ago. By contrast, much of today's ludology uses the concept of procedural rhetoric, coined by Ian Bogost, the art of persuasion through rule-based representations and interactions. You've heard of this before if you've watched any of our videos. It effectively examines how games teach you how the world works by designing how the game works. The opposite of that, what Bogost refers to as the spoken word, writing, images, or moving pictures, I call surface design. This duality of surface design and procedural rhetoric perceives the game like a machine that produces visuals, audio, and text on the surface, which fall under narratology, and hides its mechanical underpinning, the realm of ludology and procedural rhetoric, under its hood. They are one and cannot be separated. So, if this distinction is so outdated, why am I telling you all of this? Well, it's because this is how you approach a game this gigantic. I will analyze the game using both approaches in tandem, but I will also use their names to structure the analysis because they still provide a clear pattern. A first chapter on narratology divides the game up into different categories of surface design, while a second chapter on ludology cuts the game into pieces of mechanics, rules, and goals. Because of the sheer amount that I quote them compared to other sources, I must also briefly introduce Stuart Hall, sort of the founder of cultural studies, and Mike Krang, professor for cultural geography at the University of Durham, because their writing lays the groundwork for many of the cultural concepts we need for the analysis. So, prepare to see their names a lot. And now, before we get to the analysis, we must shortly define what imperialism even is. Now, I could just quote a lexicon entry to you, but that wouldn't really be enough. Stuart Hall warns that ideologies do not operate through single ideas. They operate in clusters. As you enter an ideological field and pick out any one nodal representation or idea, you immediately trigger a whole chain of connotative associations. So, if our hypothesis is that Civilization 5 presents history and culture through the lens of imperialism, what other associated ideas would it then also have to adopt? This is the list that I ultimately landed on: colonialism, othering, determinism, teleology, essentialism, nationalism, the ecological fallacy, the Enlightenment, Orientalism, exoticism, Eurocentrism, and, of course, meta-narratives. So let's briefly sum up what these terms mean, how they are connected, and what ties them to imperialism. And let's start with that central term. Imperialism refers to the formation of an empire, a process distinct from colonialism, which instead emphasizes the foundation of colonies. These ideologies seem distinct by name, but they actually build on each other. Every global empire would require initial colonies, and any colony heralds the expansion of an empire. For the sake of brevity, I will often just use imperialism to refer to both. One of the central tools of imperialism is the representation of the subaltern, the oppressed, arguing a hierarchy that legitimizes future actions against them, for example by dehumanizing them, by naturalizing their culture, or by weaving their desired fate, read extinction, into the net of a romanticized manifest destiny. This is nowhere more apparent than with the binary oppositions established between Westerners and colonized natives. Michel de Certeau's opposition of the civilized to the primitive, for example, sums up the rhetoric established during the colonization of the Americas, which painted the colonized peoples, in this case the South American tribe of the Tupi, as inherently inferior. We work, they laze about. We're separate individuals, they're one cohesive mass. We dress ourselves appropriately, they wear ornaments, which is very different, mind you. Binary oppositions projected onto cultures are the result of othering, whereby the self is defined in relation to the characteristics of an other culture. It paints the foreign as inherently different and turns it into a canvas on which to unload the fears, burdens, and desires that your own identity wants to exclude from its self-image. Hey, I'd like to have a life full of free time and pleasure, but I'm not allowed to want that, so that's not me, it's them. Look at that sad bunch, having fun. One tool to project inferiority onto that other is determinism, as defined by cultural studies. These are approaches which seek to find a single cause for events. Possibly the most famous determinism, and also the most relevant to our topic, is environmental determinism, an inherently racist tool designed to forge imperialist hierarchies, as Krang describes. This school saw the development of cultures as a process of human adaptation to basically climatic factors. It suggested the Northern Hemisphere's temperate regions had naturally achieved the greatest cultural and economic development because the climate forced the populace to work, but rewarded such labor, unlike the tropics, where it suggested people had not needed to labor, and the extreme north, where existence was so marginal the possibilities for accumulating wealth were limited. As such, it formed a self-serving justification for European imperialism. Environmental determinism is a so-called legitimation theory. It only served to legitimate social, political, and economic ambitions. It naturalized the idea of an imperial struggle for world domination and then preemptively blessed all actions that would lead there. Sorry, peoples of insert country here, you never had access to the resources we had, so it is only natural for us to take over your territory. What do you say, you had a lot of them? Well, then you must have had too many, so you naturally became lazy and deserve to be conquered. Can't help it. The secular determinism is sort of the reverse of the more religious teleology, a directed story where the predetermined endpoint guides the interpretation of prior events, a historical evolution towards an inevitable end state. A prominent US-American example would be the concept of manifest destiny, whereby a community selects and interprets historical events as the manifestations of an inevitable destiny, steering history towards itself. Both determinism and teleology work because they mistake cultural reasons for natural reasons, which is also referred to as essentialism, the view that there are essential properties which define what something is and without which it could not be what it is, ascribing a fundamental and unchanging core value to something that is not seen as negotiable or contestable. So-called naturalization therefore ascribes a fictional, supposedly natural essence, like IQ, to a cultural construct, such as race or gender, in order to present a perceived difference between, for example, races as natural, meaning genetic, so as to legitimize unethical actions against them. While essentialism links a set of core traits to an arbitrary group of people, ethnic nationalism links an arbitrary group of people to a geographical space in an attempt to justify not only the claim to that space, but also to strengthen the unity of the group by constructing a sense of home and belonging. Ethnic nationalism identifies culture with a space and the space with a people, forming a circular logic whereby one's right to belong to a space is seen as dependent on possessing the culture that is also used to identify the territory. Ethnic nationalism is yet another legitimation theory that fabricates a point in the past which is considered authentic and justifies the exclusion of anyone who therefore doesn't belong. The neatly categorized worldview that nationalism propagates struggles with globalizing trends which slowly dissolve those borders that enable nationalism. This results in increasing conservatism in order to defend the perceived purity against contamination from outside, threatening the enforced cultural unity. Seeing cultural link to identity in this way animates and is animated by a series of fears. This is then an identity of retrenchment rather than expansion, in contrast to the colonial era. The post-colonial phase of imperialism is therefore isolationism, driven not by expansion, but by fears of cultural and ethnic impurity, culminating in conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement or cultural Marxism. Both essentialism and ethnic nationalism rely on the so-called ecological fallacy, assuming what applies to the group as a whole applies to each member individually, when actually the traits of a group are the result of summing up the various combined traits of its members. As an example, if a country's ranking in the World Happiness Report decreases by 10%, this does not mean that all citizens of that nation rated their lives as 10% less satisfactory than the previous year. Factors like age or class stratify the demographic into very distinct subgroups. A high-income class making up 50% of a population may have experienced a 20% happier year, while the low-income class felt 40% more unsatisfied. The ecological fallacy looks past these ruptures within a group in order to maintain clear categories. This blind trust in categorization can be traced back to the Enlightenment, the faith in the ability of reason, a change in outlook on the world where science was seen as the key to demystifying the world. Nowadays, the Enlightenment is often seen much more positively because science has since taken serious steps to combat its discriminatory past, albeit not entirely. The original Enlightenment, however, spoke of universal truths that were often based on the experience of white, male European scientists. It provided colonial-era scientists with the confidence to categorize the world according to their own subjective metrics. This made it an essential tool to control and master the Earth. Get a load of old Darwin here. The sense of smell is of extremely slight service, if any, even to the dark-colored races of men, in whom it is much more highly developed than in the white and civilized races. This scientific legitimation of hierarchies is best observed in the othering of Africa as the barbaric counterpart to the civilized Europe, forming the two ends of the completely scientific ethnic evolutionary scale that, purely objectively of course, categorized black people as naturally underdeveloped humans. We had no choice, guys. The numbers don't lie. Computer says colonize. Another product of the supposedly objective but practically made-up knowledge of the other is Orientalism. According to its founder Edward Said, the concept describes a sovereign Western consciousness out of whose unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged, governed not by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. Orientalism basically constructs a supposed reality of the unified Orient through observing the Orient from the outside. However, the Orient exists only through that gaze, only in the minds of the Westerners. The most popular hierarchy argued by Orientalism is that of future over past, of progress versus stasis. The Occident defined itself as progressive in the sense of making history and changing the world, while the East was defined as static and timeless. Europe shapes the future, while the East can only experience repetitions. Exoticism explains how this othering is then used to justify economic exploitation of foreign so-called exotic goods. The exotic, the foreign, increasingly gained throughout the empire the connotations of a stimulating difference with which the domestic could be safely spiced. Aside from exploitation, the trading of exotic goods also served to turn the potentially dangerous and subversive foreign into a literal object that could be bought, owned, and, therefore, controlled, turning each land and people into just another commodity. A commodity whose meaning was defined by the exploiter, not the exploitee. Orientalism and exoticism are both tied to a Western worldview that does not recognize its own bias and therefore assumes its views to be universal. This ideology, Eurocentrism, describes how Europe and European cultural assumptions are assumed to be the normal, the natural, or the universal. Orientalism examines the ways in which Eurocentrism actually produces other cultures. It defines this fictional Orient purely through how it differs from Europe, and everything that you don't point out in that definition must therefore be just like Europe, because in this worldview, Europe is the baseline and everything else is just a deviation. I should point out that European culture refers to the broad term of Western culture, which most importantly, as the result of colonialism, also includes cultural biases found in North America, as well as many other communities around the globe
across the Commonwealth
that are similarly rooted in European worldviews. They usually share a similar identity supported by similar projections onto other cultures and employ a similar set of symbols to produce meaning. For example, those derived from Christianity. Short excursion here. When I was in elementary school, I vividly remember that in RE we had to draw a picture of a mosque, and on the top of the minaret I drew a cross. Because to me, the cross didn't symbolize Christianity, it symbolized religion. That's a fairly innocent example of Eurocentrism. The teacher didn't even say anything. I think it took me like several days to even figure out on my own where exactly I had messed up. And finally, we arrive at the all-encompassing idea of meta-narratives, or grand narratives, put forth by philosophers like Jean-François Lyotard and why can't I say this name? Ludwig Wittgenstein. This theory describes supposedly definitive narratives that are actually unfit to properly explain the complex reality of competing discourses. They present overarching explanations that claim to speak for all people, that claim to be universal and not particular, that claim not to be bounded in a language game, unlike the cultures they comment upon. These gross oversimplifications can be found in all areas of discourse, like class reductionism, the industrial age narrative of constant technological advancement, or even the mere general conception of history as a story of continuous cultural progress along one linear path, where some are of course faster than others. A meta-narrative inherently combines some of the most egregious imperialist tactics. It lays universal claim on the correct perspective, while also creating an other by excluding all other narratives, because it does not perceive itself as one, it doesn't compete with other narratives, it claims to observe them from above, a meta-narrative. It finds a singular determinist and undebatable cause for the events of history, while also providing a teleological, inevitable outlook into the future. Meta-narratives carry the tone of science, but are also poetic and simple. They feel like they make sense, because they offer simple answers to complex questions. It is therefore the foundation of meta-narratives upon which imperialism thrives best. These ideologies are the ones we need to look out for when examining the game for traces of imperialism. So let's start with, as Edward Said says, all cultures tend to make representations of foreign cultures the better to master or in some way control them. Naturally, the surface design in Civ 5 is no exception. Its explicit portrayal of real-world cultures practically invites a thorough investigation into how exactly the game represents these cultures.
Name 3 countries outside of America if you can.
Spain, Germany, France.
Name 1 in Africa.
Ideology revolves around inclusion and exclusion. When designers include and exclude particular ethnicities within a game, the subtext of their design choices carries ideological weight. Representation thus starts with the variety of playable civilizations on offer. And when you categorize the available nations by continent, you can't deny the obvious Eurocentrism on display. The most striking contrast is the representation of Europe through 15 nations in total, while Africa, a culturally diverse continent with almost double the population count, is represented through less than half as many civilizations. The same can be said for America, offering an immense variety of native peoples but only settling for 5, next to the United States and Brazil. This trend continues when we examine which exact cultures were included. Hayes acknowledges that civilization favors an ethnocentric view of non-industrialized cultures, but fails to note that the mere visual depiction of cultures is just part of the puzzle. Instead, representation starts with dividing the cultural continuum of the world and then deciding which cultures to include in the first place. This table contrasts a selection of real, presently recognized countries to historical nations out of which they arguably developed, and marking those included in Civ 5 through capital letters. This reveals, yet again, a Eurocentric worldview that favors the representation of present-day Western nations over historical ones, while favoring the historical Orientalist version of non-European nations over modern representations of their current countries. This results in a rhetoric whereby the West is represented through the present and everyone else is represented through the past. You can play as Germany, but you cannot play as the Teutons. You can play as France, but not as the Gauls. By contrast, you cannot play as Turkey, only as the Ottomans. And if you want to play as Mexico, I guess you must settle for the Aztecs, and so on and so forth. You may notice that Italy breaks that rule, which is actually explained through another rule, which is that the game heavily dwells on classicism, the veneration of European antiquity. Venice, the Roman, and the Byzantine Empire mark important items in the cultural memory of Europe. This classicist view on history also explains the inclusion of Carthage over Tunisia, Persia over Iran, and Assyria and Babylonia over Iraq and Kuwait. The colonialist bias, on the other hand, governs the inclusion of Siam, the Inca, Maya, Aztecs, and the Zulu over their respective modern counterparts, Thailand, Peru, Mexico, and South Africa. In true Orientalist fashion, we see every culture through the lens of Western history, rather than the cultural memories of the societies themselves. The exclusion of South Africa in favor of the Zulu in particular is a curious choice. Not only does it exclude an entire continent's second most economically strongest country, but could also have provided a fitting leader, deeply ingrained in both Western and South African cultural memory, with Nelson Mandela. Instead, a symbol of colonial war was chosen over a symbol of post-colonial reconciliation. This sentiment even extends to the leaders chosen to visually represent their respective nations. Shoshone chief Pocatello, for example, is tied to Western history because of his famous wars against the invading Western force that were massacring his people, and was thus chosen over less antagonistic chiefs, such as Washakie, who is no less significant to Shoshone history, but didn't wage war against the settlers and does therefore not fit the theme of the game. When it comes to the leader's actual portrayal, the most striking undercurrent is not how the leaders themselves are designed, but in which setting they are shown. It becomes apparent rather quickly that leaders of cultures subjected to Western imperialism are often not shown in their throne rooms, offices, or even homes, but outside, surrounded by nature, which hurts their credibility as civilized politicians, most often to the backdrop of a picturesque, unharmed landscape, ready to be explored and exploited. This is most obvious with Indonesia, Polynesia, India, the Zulu, the Iroquois, the Shoshone, and Morocco. Ahmed, what are you doing? Look at this. This is your palace. You personally had it built. Why are you out in the desert at night? It's cold. Get inside. The setting sun in Pocatello's leader screen even hints at the teleology of a nation facing its inevitable doom, playing into the manifest destiny narrative of the white settlers.
Look at all those chickens!
Imperialism was marked out by a planetary consciousness. All the world was put into typologies, hierarchies, and subdivisions according to a Western conceptual map. Civ 5's portrayal of a European worldview as the universal default affects pretty much all its dimensions of representation, be it visuals, naming conventions, or plain cultural concepts. Different civilizations share, for example, the same base buildings, units, and technologies, consistent in both their icons and names. Base units even share the same looks, no matter what culture they're from. German knights look just like Aztec knights. What is an Aztec knight? Well, I would love to say whatever you want it to be, but that's not true. An Aztec knight, of course, looks like a European knight, because when Civ 5 thinks generic, it thinks European. This Eurocentrism is especially apparent with religion. Although Civ 5 provides a basic pool of 13 culturally diverse religions to choose from, the game's strict system forces every one of them into the very same tight corset. Every religion needs a name and a symbol, they are assigned a holy city, and they all need great prophets to thrive. Religious units, such as missionaries and inquisitors, can be recruited by every religion, even when that religion does in reality not even feature these concepts. Like Sikhism, what would a Sikh inquisitor even do? Even the symbols for these entities only draw from Christian symbolism. Great prophets, for example, are depicted as white men with beards, a tunic and a staff, conjuring up imagery of Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. Similarly, the symbol for the faith resource is represented by a white dove with an olive branch, framing religious faith exclusively as that of Noah in the God of the Old Testament. This focus on Christian concepts also explains why out of the 13 religions, 3 are just denominations of Christianity: Catholicism, Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodoxy. However, Civ 5's most notable universal representation is the calculation of time. Firstly, it counts time along a linear scale, following the Western concept, rather than allowing for culturally dependent systems like a circular perception of time, as in, for example, the Mayan or Chinese calendars. In his blog, lead designer John Schaefer explains that the specific year labels were implemented to inject a sense of progressing through history. Into this plays the logarithmic calculation of time. The more turns have passed, the fewer years pass with each turn, so as the progression of time slows down, technological and cultural progress per year accelerates. All of this leans heavily into the grand narrative of continual, ever-accelerating technological and cultural progress. To top it all off, the game makes universal use of the Gregorian calendar, denoting the starting year of history itself at 4000 BC, long before any religion has been founded to anchor time in the birth year of its messiah, or even before any technology has been developed to tell time this accurately. This calculation never changes, even when the player's civilization adopts a religion with a different calculation of time, like Islam. A central aspect of Civ 5, both visually and mechanically, are so-called wonders. These can be natural wonders found on specific tiles around the map, or constructed wonders, which are either national wonders and thus generic, or unique world wonders, recognizable symbols of real-world history. Wonders provide large boosts and sometimes unique mechanics to their owners, which is why we should look at them in detail. 17 natural wonders can be found through exploration. At first glance, all continents appear equally represented, but a closer look reveals a strong Western bias. 3 sites alone are from the US. By contrast, China, for example, is only present with Mount Kailash, despite the many unique items that Chinese geography could have provided, like
九寨沟
National Park, Mount
三清
or the South China Karst, all of which are recognized UN World Heritage Sites, and most of which the game's Western audience are unfamiliar with, including myself, which is why they're not included. Instead, we have 3 mythical, non-existent wonders that only reached fame through fictional tales from European explorers and treasure hunters, and that were fabricated to specifically encourage and romanticize colonialism and exploitation, namely El Dorado, the Fountain of Youth, and King Solomon's Mines. The same applies to the 46 World Wonders. Out of the 14 wonders from the ancient and classical era, 8 are from ancient Greece alone. The particular selection of Greek wonders suggests peaceful values of religion, science, and trade, while the only 2 Chinese wonders in the classical era are the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, both of which paint Chinese culture as revolving around its military, whereas the absolutely imposing military might of ancient Greece is left unrepresented. In addition, the Greek wonders' relevance to Western memory is emphasized through elisions in their names that imply an expected familiarity from the player. It's not called the Great Library of Alexandria, just the Great Library. It's the Colossus,
of Rhodes,
the Great Lighthouse,
of Pharaohs,
and the Oracle,
of Delphi.
This stands in contrast to, for example, the Great Mosque of Jenny from the medieval era, which assumes a need for clarification of which great mosque the game refers to, precisely because it is not European. The specific sets of wonders of an era also assign certain themes to those eras. Medieval wonders that produce faith frame the Middle Ages as the rise of religion, and those of the Renaissance indicate an age of art and culture. But that framing poses a problem. Framing wonders from, for example, America as products of the major themes that dominated Europe at the time suggests that their construction was subject to the same societal developments as those found on the other side of the globe. Like, we call it the Renaissance because of the renewed interest in classical history and art following the Middle Ages, which were supposedly dominated by the tyranny of the Catholic Church. That's the narrative, and to conform to that narrative, Civ 5 fills the Middle Ages with religious wonders that produce faith, like Notre Dame or the Hagia Sophia, sure, but also the Great Mosque of Jenny, okay, and Machu Picchu and Borobudur. Now, Machu Picchu and Borobudur were built as religious sites, yes, but for reasons completely different from those that made the Middle Ages religious in the eyes of those that defined the term Middle Ages. Their religiosity is at best coincidental, but it is framed as if it wasn't. Keep that in mind for later. Likewise, the Renaissance era revolves around a rather narrow Western definition of high culture, represented through wonders like the Globe Theatre and the Sistine Chapel. This evokes sentiments of artists like Shakespeare and Michelangelo as the global pinnacles and thus universal symbols of their respective professions. The industrial and modern eras reached the height of Eurocentrism. Here, Brazil is the only represented country not from Europe or North America, with Cristo Redentor, which still symbolizes the success of the missionary work of Western imperialism. Suspiciously absent from these eras are any wonders representing the two world wars, or even war in general. Instead, the game attempts to reread this chapter of Western history by establishing a new canon of wonders that loudly proclaim peace and unification, like the Eiffel Tower, the Brandenburg Gate, or the Statue of Liberty. Because otherwise, the game would need to admit major global humanitarian low points in human history that would contradict the continuous upward narrative. Lastly, wonders from the atomic and information eras show how the game struggles to take a stance on isolationism. The Great Firewall is arguably a reference to China's censoring of the internet, which projects isolationism onto the other. China! But from a purely mechanical perspective, it provides highly beneficial bonuses and no disadvantages whatsoever. So, is isolationism and censorship good? The surface design suggests no, but the mechanics decidedly say yes. The Hubble Space Telescope could have remedied this as a symbol for international joint science, but is betrayed by its mechanics, which render the wondrous benefits exclusive to the nation that built it, which is not how the real telescope works. So those are the world wonders. Noteworthy national wonders are the East India Company, Oxford University, and the Circus Maximus, which represent specific Western buildings and institutions that everyone can still build simultaneously. This leads to counterintuitive situations where India itself has no other choice than to create the East India Company in the pursuit to raise trade profits, or is incentivized to construct Oxford University to raise the science output of Mumbai. The ironic fact that the real East India Company raised trade profits by exploiting India is apparently irrelevant.
Greetings from the edge of the world! I found it! It's a big wall, like this.
Vincent Morgue, I think it's French. Vincent Morgue defines the purpose of a game's UI like this. The primordial role of the game interface is, just like any other interface, to enable information to be provided, accessed, and applied. So far, so good. The presentation of said information, however, brings with it certain implied priorities that reveal ideologies in their design. The centerpiece of Civ 5's interface is the portrayal of the world, seen through a bird's eye view. Fernandez Vara interprets, Civilization 5 uses this removed point of view to allow the player to get a picture of what is going on in the world. The player identifies with the point of view in a generic role, such as a god of sorts or commander ruling the world. Now, as much as I agree, I don't think that argument holds much water when confronted by the likes of David Myers from earlier. How else would the game show the map? From the ground? The map means nothing. Stop reading stuff into it. Everything looks like it does because of the mechanics. And the mechanics also mean nothing. Nothing means anything. Instead, I think it is helpful to point out that this observation is already informed by the design of the map itself. The player perspective is that of a colonial commander leaning over a war table, not just due to the position of the camera, but the form and function of said war table. Civ 5 chooses to present its world map entirely in the style normalized through Western imperialism. World and minimap take on a rectangular shape, with ice covering both top and bottom, heavily implying an alignment towards the north. This is further emphasized through the inability to turn the camera. It can only be panned, forcing north permanently to the top of the screen. The rectangular shape itself also naturalizes the inherently deformed projection map, a major tool of Eurocentrism, as actual reality. This leads to the in-game world really only making sense as a cylindrical shape rather than an actual globe. A button next to the minimap allows to change the more natural presentation of the world to a heavily abstracted one. This so-called strategic view breaks the displayed information down to strategic matters. It represents tiles only as the resources they hold and emphasizes the location of units and borders. Now, all of these design decisions may seem trivial, but they're not. I'll leave you to decide how they compare to the definition of imperialist cartography by Australian scholar Bill Ashcroft, co-author of the foundational book on post-colonialism called The Empire Writes Back. The allegorization of space and its hierarchization is defined by maps, first by the decision as to which projection to favor, since this privileges some land spaces over others, or by the decision to orient all maps on a north-south axis, or by the creation of a body of special maps that divide the land into such objective categories as climactic regions, population densities, and, not least, natural resources. One distinctly imperialist aspect of Civ 5's map is the portrayal of unexplored and unowned land. The fog of war is portrayed as impenetrable clouds on the main map and as pitch-black areas in strategic view, as opposed to cloud-free skies and bright colors for areas that are owned and explored, both of which apply the metaphor of light versus darkness. Tying light to civilization paints savagery as inherently dark, down to the color of the skin. Quote, "It is the accounts of the West bringing light, civilizing Africa, the accounts of missionaries flooding the continent with the light of reason and Christianity that paint Africa so dark." Similarly, borders and territories are represented on both maps at all times, which draws particular attention to territory that nobody owns. On the minimap, this neutral territory is marked green and can be likened to the blank spaces found in early imperialist maps. They signify an open and inviting virginal space into which the European imagination can project itself, and into which the European, usually male explorer, must penetrate. Okay, Bill. On a final note, Civ 5's menu and font design mimic the style of Art Deco. Producer Dennis Shirk claims that with the Art Deco, the interface designer wanted to evoke that prosperous time in the country when everybody designed beautiful, forward-looking steel mammoths in cities. Now, even when looking past the obvious romanticizations in that statement, everybody and the country still refer not to the world, but to the West in general and the United States in particular, while that prosperous time during the Roaring Twenties does not only exclude narratives from countries that did not share this economic era, but also marks a time where colonialism was still in full effect and arguably contributed to the imbalance that brought said prosperity. Ian Bogost himself defines procedural rhetoric not as a specifically video game-related term, but one that applies to any form of persuasion through interactive patterns. Quote, "We tend to think of procedures as fixed and unquestionable. Consider the police officer who carries out a clearly unethical action, but later offers the defense, 'I was following procedure.' Gameplay, therefore, has the potential to arguably carry even more persuasive power than the surface design, due to how covertly it operates in contrast to words and visuals. Games teach you ideology by presenting that ideology not as an ideology, but as a natural fact, and it is harder to argue against something that you do not even perceive as an opinion. This means that procedural rhetoric can only be revealed by questioning even the most basic patterns and the seemingly fixed traditions of game design. That's just the way it is exactly the kind of reactionary thinking that we must avoid. So let's start with the basics. Game design involves three main aspects: goals, rules, and mechanics. Goals are defined as the elements that dictate and reward player actions in order to lead them to a winning scenario. Civ 5's main goals are its main victory conditions. They embody the player's desired rewards. Rules are defined as the elements that dictate how the game works. They describe how one element is linked to another and what is triggered by which condition. Rules are always active and always true, and therefore act independently of player input. One example from Civ 5 would be that a nation's access to a new luxury resource raises their happiness. Another, that after accumulating enough happiness, a civilization enters a golden age. Mechanics are famously defined as the verbs of the game, the palette of actions available to the player. In short, they describe what the player is allowed and able to do. Examples from Civ 5 would be the player's ability to order the production of caravans in eligible cities. Another, that upon completion, she can choose between which cities these caravans will trade resources. So, mechanics are the player's options to interact with the game's rules in the pursuit of the game's goals. The fixed relations between mechanics, rules, and goals form the procedures of a game, which communicate a rhetoric, the procedural rhetoric, back to the player who interacts with them. The procedural rhetoric tells us how the game understands and makes sense of complex systems in the real world, how it abstracts and simplifies actual, unrepresentably complex procedures into a simplified model. What does it emphasize? What does it devalue or leave out? What interactions does it penalize, and which ones are rewarded? Let's start with the two most abstract topics, the rules around progress and control, and then slowly work our way towards ever more tangible instances of imperialist procedural rhetoric. Oh God, is this my way of telling you to stick around till the end to find out? I guess it is, but I promise it's all relevant. The script used to be more than twice as long. So let's revisit that issue about European eras as global eras.
Stone is dead. Prepare for the Age of Bronze.
Just like its surface design, Civ 5's gameplay, as that of all Civ games for that matter, revolves around one core theme: progress. Jorge Albor calls Civ 5's premise modernist myths of linear and irreversible progress. Hayes claims the series favors the inevitable triumph of technological progress, and even the game's lead designer John Schaefer himself admits that the overarching theme of Civ is human history as the story of continual upward progress. Now, the problem with this grand narrative of perpetual progress is that it is designed to provide us with a supposedly objective hierarchy of nations, which consequently likens the coexistence of human communities to a game that can be objectively won. It first defines what counts as progress, and then determines winners and losers based on that definition, which is, of course, the West. The West is progress. Whatever the meta-narrative considers to be Western achievements and ideals, it then holds aloft as the universal goals of all cultures, who all merely aspire to become the West. This implication is one of the reasons why we stop referring to the Global South as developing countries, because that paints them as losers who are just incapable of catching up to the developed countries. It's like coming up with the game of who is most like me, and then deeming everyone else unworthy of the winning title, because that must of course go to me, and everyone else must still be in the process of developing to eventually be me. In keeping with that narrative, the game essentially presents the Western account of history, its stages, options, and paths, as the unquestionable history all civilizations must undergo. Dom Ford, from the IT University of Copenhagen, points out that the technology tree is tiered into eras that solidify this Eurocentric homonarrativization. That's one for the big word jar. From ancient to information era, all civilizations must follow the same technology tree and thereby inevitably redraw the Western path through history. And since eras are based on certain cultural shifts within society, at least in reality, this implies that, for example, China society is also implicitly subjected to exactly the same socio-political reactions to events and technologies as those found in the history of the United States. But really, just as with the grand narrative itself, The imperialism here lies not so much in the idea that all civilizations climb the same tree, as Ford claims, but in the fact that in framing Western history as the overarching norm, real-world, non-Western civilizations are not only excluded from the game's representation of the present, but included into the representation of the past. The universal tech tree and its Western eras imply that a nation that has not developed certain Western technologies or cultural conventions represents a past stage of Western society and will therefore always lag behind the Western pioneers of development. For example, according to Civ 5, it is impossible to develop education without knowing how to ride horses, which excludes all historical cultures native to Middle and South America. Or inventing drama and poetry requires writing, which excludes all oral traditions, like that of many African cultures. Or many European cultures, for that matter. Hi, this is Malte from The Edit. Just to clarify that there were in fact very few ancient cultures that did have a writing system, and African cultures did actually produce quite a few. What I'm trying to say here is that the idea that drama and poetry require writing is positively ahistorical and deeply linked to a specifically Roman understanding of poetry, especially in contrast to the oral traditions of what the Romans referred to as the barbarous tribes of the north. Anyway, on with the show. Similarly, creating a printing press catapults you into the Renaissance era, which means China was like 500 years ahead of its time. Oh, but only if they also had noblemen in metal armor fighting on horseback. Obviously, you need that before you can print letters. You can't just take shortcuts on this racetrack of progress, you have to pass every single milestone of Western history, so we can assess how closely you resemble the Western ideal. To that end, a metric ton of statistics and rankings are updated in real time to inform the player about who is currently winning this race of progress. And the best indicator among all of them is technological advancement, as the most important factor in the production of everything: economy, military, and most importantly, culture. In Civ 5, cultural superiority requires technological superiority, and equating the two is a central part of this grand narrative of progress. So what exactly does this Western progress actually look like? First of all, it requires a constantly growing population, not only to accelerate research, but also to make use of the new technologies. But a rising population lowers a civilization's happiness. As a result, the net growth of your culture's happiness often slows down over time, or sometimes even stagnates. Now, on the face of it, that's not progress. But here's the twist. Happiness conveniently only becomes truly relevant when it enters negative numbers. This means that it is perfectly fine to min-max your nation's growth by investing just enough to keep your citizens barely above the threshold below which they would go on strike. What a foreign concept. This tells us exactly how Civilization 5 defines progress. It certainly does not mean making your citizens as happy as possible. It means growth for the sake of growth. And wouldn't that be a great example of anti-capitalist satire? Unfortunately, this is not a joke about the drawbacks of capitalism because it is framed by the game's rampant celebration of its benefits, particularly its veneration of Fordism and Taylorism. So what then is the opposite of progress? Well, where progress is rewarded, stasis is death, meaning that the game heavily punishes decisions that lead to technological stagnation. This is because research often unlocks new mechanics that further boost research. As a consequence, progress accelerates progress, which only emphasizes the perceived standstill of less developed countries. The result echoes the age-old narrative of the timeless Orient. Civilizations with inferior science output merely represent a past stage of more developed countries who just made better decisions, while they are forever trapped in the past. If England has entered the modern era and India is still stuck in the Middle Ages, India will rank far lower. Plus, it will be practically impossible for India to, literally, catch up to England. This means that in the game, just as in colonial rhetoric, cultures from different points in history actually do coexist, granting the cultures of the present dominion over the cultures of the past, and defining present and past according to a Western understanding of progress. One thing that curiously doesn't progress in Civ 5 is the definition of science. Since science develops technologies, and technologies in turn unlock eras, with universal eras and technologies also comes an implication of universal science. But according to Krang, claims for a universal objective science have been deeply implicated in racist and imperialist pasts, best observed in the early Enlightenment. Every civilization amasses the science resource to fill the same singular science meter. As a result, the game's definition of science stays the same across all cultures and eras. No source of science ever loses its output as the result of technological or societal changes, and therefore its universal claims are never questioned. Now, to clarify, there is real science that produces models that can consistently predict reality, but all science is performed in the ideological framework of its time. In fact, for a long time now, modern scientific etiquette has been to point out the shortcomings of your own perspective, whereas during the Enlightenment, for example, it was perfectly fine, for white men, to wield science like weaponized religion and just make stuff up to put yourself on top of a hierarchy that you just discovered. So, when Civilization 5 presents the science output of the 18th century as universally true and still relevant 200 years later, that is kinda iffy.
Jewish space lasers.
Civilization is a game of emergence, which means that it is played in a way that the game designer did not predict.
I barely saw what happened.
That level took like a year to make. More than that. And it's done.
At least he used the guns I made. That's nice.
And that it elevates the position of the player to the author of the narrative that emerges from the dynamic gameplay. Schaefer himself claims that players want to feel like they're in control. True randomness eliminates that feeling of ownership. This means that Civ 5 ultimately portrays history not as a largely random chain of events, but as carefully directed by powerful omniscient forces with clear agendas. To do so, it presents every decision by the player and the AI as leading up to a predictable future event, and every event as the intended result of a conscious decision by a handful of all-powerful actors. Everything that happens does so in order to serve a greater purpose preordained by them. And because nothing is outside of their control, all of history is the result of the fight between good and evil. Now, that's not how reality works, and that is why we refer to it as teleology. It also echoes the fringes of Christian conservatism. Nothing can be unintended. Everything must be part of a bigger plan. Everything is actually purposefully designed. Man is at the center of the universe, and the sun orbits the earth. If something bad happens to you, that can't be a coincidence, and it certainly can't be the result of a system that we all uphold. It is because a secret cabal of very few all-powerful beings congregate in the basement of a pizza shop to eat babies and conspire against you and everything you stand for. They are weak, but they control everything, and only I can stop them. So vote for me, so I can put an end to this madness and restore the divine order, where everyone is again placed in the category they belong and assume the role they're supposed to. The game presents itself largely as a clockwork with set gears that turn predictably when moved by the few powerful actors that can move them. History, where meaning arises from interpreting complex, almost randomly associated events through the lens of intention and oversimplified causality, is therefore presented as actual intention and causality. This gives rise to both teleological and environmentally determinist readings of history. Teleology can be observed in how the player sets goals for her culture and then, of course, interprets every event in its history as part of the path to said goal. She might, for example, set a goal for cultural domination and then construct sacred buildings to accumulate enough faith to reliably reach 200 faith at turn 40, which will predictably trigger a great prophet to spawn, who she then plans to use to found her religion, which will turn her capital into its holy city, which will give her an edge in the race for cultural impact and contribute to her eventual cultural victory.
You have achieved victory.
And unlike reality, she would be right in reading it that way, because there is an actual consistent agenda behind all these events, and they were actually planned out that way. By her. Be it decisions by the player or the AI, nothing in the game is too complex to be explained as the direct intention of either yourself or your enemy. Environmental determinism, by contrast, describes how the player interprets the current condition of a nation as the sole result of her starting conditions. Her first settler might, for example, have spawned surrounded by infertile tundra tiles and too far away from the sea to move there without wasting too many precious turns. Or her nation might be out of reach of important strategic resources, such as iron, coal, oil, and uranium, and consequently doomed from the start. And again, unlike inexplicably complex reality, this would be not an oversimplification, but a correct analysis, because in the game there actually are singular identifiable causes for the shape of an entire culture. These forms of rhetoric ultimately justify assumptions of superiority. In the game, everything that happens does actually happen for a reason, because everything is part of someone's agenda for domination. This means that if something good happens, everything is going according to your plan for domination. And if something bad happens, this was either the plan of an opponent whose goal can only be to destroy you, or you were doomed from the start. And while these are all perfectly reasonable interpretations of in-game events, they also paint the exact same conspiratorial worldview that justified imperialism. Imperial conquest was also thought of as devised by a divine force, and its opponents, or rather victims, were first interpreted as an intentional challenge and their mere existence as an evil satanic attempt to break the resolve of the righteous settlers, and later as cultures whose fate was already sealed by their environment anyway. Civilization just takes that narrative and turns it into hard-coded rules of its gameplay, where history is actually teleological. Now, this teleology only works if the player and the AI have full control over their nations, without any internal rifts within the culture, which leads us to... In order to maximize player control, Civ 5 employs two nationalist concepts to construct its civilizations. These are the unchallenged unity and unchallenged territory of any existing nation. Unity means that civilizations can neither split nor merge. There are no divisions within a civilization, nor are there cities or units that belong to no clearly categorized culture. The game basically denies postmodern concepts of plurality and hybridity. Perks and features apply not to specific individuals or groups within a nation, but to everyone equally. The entire nation essentially acts as one entity. This means that the player's absolute power over her civilization is never questioned. Nothing happens outside of her control. This allows her to focus on competing against other nations rather than tackling her nation's internal problems, but it also exposes what the player actually embodies. Although the surface design makes her assume the role of a leader, on a mechanical level, the game makes the player be the empire by making her omnipotent throughout her realm and allowing for cultural consistency over literal millennia. By contrast, strategy game series like City Building, Total War, and Anno put the player into the position of a leader or changing leaders of a dynasty that are in constant struggle with their subjects, confronting the player with problems absent from Civ 5, like emigration, crime, disease, or disloyalty. The absence of a tax system alone, an essential mechanic in all those titles, exemplifies how Civ 5 equates a nation's citizens with its government, and vice versa. Ford therefore concludes that the game offers no avenues for subaltern insurgency. When a civilization's happiness falls into low enough negative numbers, protests do start to occur throughout its territory. However, the uprisings are presented not as dissatisfied citizens, but as savages that roam the land murdering and pillaging. They do not exactly defy categorization, they fall into an already established imperialist category, namely barbarians. Plus, protest is tied to the global happiness meter anyway, pertaining to the entire nation, which denies oppression being tied to class, race, or gender. International divides are thus overlooked for the sake of the outside display of unity. I don't know where this graphic is going. If global happiness falls to its minimum, universal, nationwide uprisings are painted as the result of a unified dissatisfaction, rather than that of one group exploiting another. As a result, Civ 5 falls prey to the ecological fallacy, whereby every member of a nation is presented as part of the same hive mind identity. Where nations should be contested from within, they are instead portrayed through historical continuity, which supports the idea of coherent ethnic or national culture, also called ethnic nationalism.
Are we the baddies?
The second concept, unchallenged territory, binds the legitimacy of a civilization's territory to decisions of only that civilization, while other affected nations have no say in the matter. The game categorically excludes any discourse that would question a territory's belonging. Not only are there no mechanics to come to agreements with other civilizations over debated territory, but territory is never up for debate to begin with. Borders do not need to be recognized by other civilizations, they simply exist. If a nation was able to conquer land, it must therefore belong to them, and the borders are literally etched into the ground by the gods themselves. This essentialist connection between territory and culture makes a culture's existence dependent on the territory it is capable of defending, and functionally cease to exist if no territory bears its name. In Civ 5, loss of all territory equates defeat, and the culture is wiped from existence. A culture's unchallenged unity and territory therefore combine to form a pure manifestation of nationalism. Civilizations are presented as one eternally united entity that is bound to the land of its original capital and the territory that was claimed in its name. This logic also emboldens imperialism by quite literally erasing the cultures whose land you steal. No more pesky land disputes and no meddling minorities.
The new fascist left-west, and out of that marriage you will have the communist socialist system of Islam. Global corporations with a fake form of liberalism merge with radical Islam. This is the orthodoxy. This is the plan.
With the inclusion of religion, social policies, and ideology, Civilization 5 recreates a society's ideological system. Now, this poses an interesting question. How does a game about imperialism define ideology? And we can uncover this by looking into the major game rules that govern it. All ideology is presented as institutionalized, as irreversible, and as completely independent from all other ideology. Let's start with institutionalization. Civ 5's religion is a state religion, not the personal spirituality of individuals. The mechanics of religion dictate that one culture can only bring forth one religion, creating one people in one nation and one nation under one god, because it is one player that chooses it. Likewise, a civilization is only allowed to reap the benefits of its dominant religion, and cities only benefit from the city-specific perks of their majority religion. This rule employs a binary system of power that excludes minorities from all mechanical relevance, other than religious pressure, which in itself has no value unless it succeeds in reclaiming the majority. The resulting rhetoric questions any religion that does not belong. Any religious pressure from outside instigates fear of a foreign insurgency that could replace a culture's bespoke beliefs with some random stuff they don't need. No, Darius, I don't want Zoroastrianism, thank you very much. I want my religion, with my perks, that help my situation, not yours. Forcing every religion into this predefined box of an institution means that every religion mechanically functions exactly the same. Prophets found and enhance a religion, missionaries spread it, inquisitors defend it, temples feed it with the production of faith, and its holy city eternally enshrines it. Civ 5 basically only counts institutionalized milestones of Christianity as valuable elements of any religion. This leads to bizarre situations where, for example, Japan must found its preferred religion of Shinto with a great prophet, which in itself is arguably simplified, and spread it aggressively by sending out Shinto missionaries into faraway lands. Additionally, it would fill its own cities with Shinto inquisitors to root out, for example, Confucianism, which is being spread by Confucian missionaries. According to the game, religion is Christianity, and any other religion is just Christianity with a different coat of paint. Similarly, social policies and ideologies are governmental apparatuses of nationwide hegemony, rather than representing competing schools of thought. They can't be because they were selected by a single player. Also, what the game calls social policies are actually entire cultural identities that are paradoxically imposed top-down orders, because the game cannot fathom an identity that simply evolves. It must be government-issued, a social policy. Likewise, ideologies do not come in all shapes and sizes, but the entire nation adopts one all-encompassing ideology out of three very distinct extremes: fascism, communism, and us, which is none of those because we're the good guys. This means that Civ 5 also paints ideology, just like cultural identity and religion, as overt and tangible. If there is ideology, it makes itself known. This comes in handy when the game must deny ideology as the driving force behind the bulk of its own representations. According to the game, ideology is not manipulative, but obvious. So, if the game does not wear its ideology on its sleeve, it clearly cannot have one. Right? Secondly, irreversibility. All ideology in the game is permanently engraved into the culture for all eternity. The player cannot choose to change or revert her nation's religion or social policies. They are completely irreversible, which marks them as essential to the culture and practically part of its citizens' DNA. Holy cities, for example, will permanently emanate their inherent religious pressure, even if outside pressure converted all its citizens to another religion. From the perspective of an outsider, this paints foreign religion as a virus that needs to be contained and wiped out when pursuing cultural dominance. It also implies an intrinsic religious essence that no cultural or religious pressure alone can convert away, which literally binds religion to the place rather than its people. A holy city in which a religion was founded in 200 BC, but that gets converted in 500 AD, would still emanate that same original religion in the year 2000 AD, which would mean that, like Alexandria, would still convert its citizens to the cult of Serapis to this day. With social policies, Schaefer said that he wanted it to feel like you were slowly accumulating an identity over time. Japan and Germany changed significantly after World War II, but they're still Japanese and German and maintain that legacy of honor and hard work. But this permanence of social policies conveys a rather essentialist understanding of identity. Germany or Japan can indeed choose to invest in the honor tree and, for example, pick discipline early on and later adopt citizenship from the liberty tree to accelerate construction. But nothing can revert or erase the adoption of these policies. And therefore this legacy, as Schaefer calls it, is naturalized as traits inherent to every German or Japanese citizen. Because the game does not understand identity as emerging from cultural memory, no cultural developments can change or erase it. It is forever enshrined in the literal genome of the population. Now, changing your ideology is technically possible, but it erases all unlocked bonuses and brings the civilization to a complete halt for an entire turn, which is so severe that it makes picking an ideology practically irreversible. Finally, the game presents these three systems as independent from one another, when they should be interlinked. Religious perks can be chosen independent from ideology tenets and social policies, and tenets are not connected to religion or policies. In fact, this even applies to the perks within one system. Religious and ideological perks can be mixed and matched at will, and social policies in particular can end up as a nonsensical combination between liberty and piety, or rationalism and tradition. A civilization can bizarrely benefit both from secularism and monarchy at the same time, or adopt protectionism next to cultural exchange, or theocracy and mandate of heaven alongside collective rule and representation, with no real drawbacks other than having to spread its perks across more trees. By allowing this, Civ 5 completely disregards what Hall calls lines of tendential force, which tie, for example, religion to a political and ideological framework. Quote, "It would be idiotic to think that you could easily detach religion from its historical embeddedness and simply put it in another place. Nevertheless, it has no necessary intrinsic transhistorical belongingness. Essentially, while religion is bound to people, said people perpetuate other discourses that support their religion, which only makes it appear as though the religion was bound to the place. You cannot take, say, Germany's Christianity and simply replace it with Shintoism. Not because Shintoism naturally belongs to the country of Japan, but because it interlocks with a variety of dominant societal discourses that currently prop it up in Japan, and without which it wouldn't function in Germany. Hi, just another interjection here. I mean this descriptively, not prescriptively, as some of our insane politicians once proposed. Civ 5 falls into the very trap Hall outlines here. In reality, discourse does not appear static and essential because it is part of nature, but because it is part of a web of other cultural discourse that holds it in place. Instead, Civ 5 first anchors a discourse, such as religion, to nature, and then denies any connection to other discourse like ideology and social policies, constructing the exact opposite of Hall's model. This grants the player the sort of eclectic freedom to pick and choose any random assortment of ideologies for a culture, but in doing so, it presents them not as dynamic social forces, but political tools.
Oh shit, here we go again.
The first step to any goals in Civ 5 is exploration. All of the rules around resources, territory, or diplomacy motivate the player to venture into the unknown as quickly as possible. The World Congress, for example, is founded by the first nation to make contact with all other civilizations. This yields them an electoral advantage in the future, which can turn out as a major political benefit for the founding nation, and serious risks for those that oppose them. Similarly, every city-state rewards the first nation to find them with a significant amount of gold, which is in itself a highly imperialist assumption, like the romanticized tales of conquistadors being showered in Aztec gold, for no other reason than their divinity, of course. And lastly, the discovery of natural wonders is awarded with a permanent increase in happiness, arguably the resource that is most difficult to acquire in the entire game. One of the most openly controversial incentives for exploration, however, is the presence of barbarians. Not only do their camps send out soldiers to attack nearby cities, they also capture non-military units like workers, holding them hostage at their camps until freed. This recreates the Western captivity narratives of the American frontier, emphasizing how the barbarians are just a recreation of colonialist portrayals of natives. On the one hand, all natives count as one tribe, the barbarians, because that is how indigenous peoples fit the imperialist narrative best, categorized as one generalized indistinguishable other in the pursuit to erase it. On the other hand, despite their unified status, they are not allowed control over any cities and find themselves unable to produce anything but camps and soldiers. Since land can only be worked by cities, the barbarians are unable to use the land they roam, recreating that colonialist narrative which legitimized the exploitation of native territory. Since the inhabitants did not labor, an arguable assertion anyway, they did not use the land and thus did not own it. Instead, barbarians only serve one purpose, which is to paint neutral territory as the natural source of danger, and to equate the unknown with constant threat, until pacified through exploration and subsequent expansion. The barbarians must therefore mechanically lack any semblance of culture and be capable of nothing but violence. Civilizations can neither trade with them nor build diplomatic relations. They are, by all accounts, not human in the sense of interaction, but might as well have been represented on the surface as wild beasts spawning from caves and thickets.
Who's that Pokemon?
Their situation as humans, however, is best described ludically by Barber's concept of the third space. The game's rules provide the barbarians with a similarly uncanny ability to be at home anywhere, an ability that always might become the burden of having no home whatsoever. Initially, the barbarians are home across the entire map, but as their literal neutral territory, the third space, gets smaller and smaller over time, the encroaching territories of pure nations erase their neutral existence. The game's concept of territories leaves no room for those without a clearly defined home surrounded by strict borders, and once all land has been claimed by said territory that expels those who do not belong, the barbarians are home nowhere. To incentivize both exploration and expansion, the so-called Fog of War shrouds the map in mystery. The use of procedural content generation helps said mystery by making the terrain itself unpredictable. This means the maps of two different matches will never look alike, so that the player must always revert to the same explorer mindset. Interestingly, Civ 5's exploration presents a sort of ethically sound colonialism. What I mean by that is that it skips the dirty business. Like, real-world colonialism needed to put a lot of effort into obscuring the oppression that made exploration possible. By contrast, the player does not actually have to oppress the natives. The game already paints them as inherently subhuman. In actual colonialism, virgin territories were opened up by exploration and their original inhabitants killed because they were considered to be uncivilized and thus having no legal rights of ownership. But by contrast, the player does not actually have to steal the land from the natives. The land already does not belong to them. And lastly, historically, in extreme cases where peoples were seen to be without organizational forms, recognizable as such to European eyes, as in Australia, the land was declared literally empty, a terra nullius. Civ 5, however, does not even offer civilizations the option to declare desired land as no man's land. Its rules simply created as such, empty land behind a veil of darkness filled to the brim with tantalizingly precious resources. And let's talk about those.
Weapons of mass destruction.
On a basic level, Civ 5 revolves around a cycle of gathering resources and expanding an empire, whereby gathering resources enables expansion, and expansion enables gathering more resources. This loop is motivated by the rules around strategic and luxury resources. All of Civ 5's resources are quantified, which means the game tracks the quantities in which a civilization owns a resource, rather than merely whether it owns it or not, leading to a rhetoric where more is always better. This especially applies to strategic resources. Their number determines the amount of military units or war machines a nation can build that require said resource, such as oil for battleships or aluminum for jet fighters. This means that commanding and maintaining a powerful military, and therefore survival, is virtually impossible without ruling over and exploiting a large territory. This is an obvious requirement for success, even where the game attempts to construct the exact opposite. Venice, for example, is the only civilization incapable of founding new cities, of course, but therefore also tends to rank extremely low in competitive rankings. The exact locations of strategic resources are invisible until certain technology has been developed, like, for example, industrialization, revealing sites for coal. This motivates rampant expansion early on, simply out of the paranoia to be left out of the other civilization's powerful achievements, because your own territory might suddenly be revealed to be short on supply. Since all strategic resources are essential to the most powerful military units throughout the ages, they are valued so highly that trading for them with other nations will usually yield very disadvantageous deals. Even worse, trade would also tie the upkeep of one's army to diplomatic relations, which often prove temporary, especially in times of war, where said army would be most needed. If, for example, France is allied with Poland, and you get all of your oil from Poland, you can't invade France with your shiny new tanks that need oil to run. You must conquer Poland first, so you own the oil. While military strength is tied to acquiring strategic resources through city building in turn is tied to acquiring a large number of luxury resources. Founding new cities vastly accelerates the accumulation of unhappiness, and raising happiness is achieved best by gaining access to as big of a variety of different luxury resources as possible. This makes the exploitation of said resources the first priority after expanding into new territory. You can't just found a new city and build a reasonable economy. You need to first quench your citizens' irrational thirst for exotic goods from the new colonies. This promotes a commodity-focused view on other cultures that only cares for foreign lands so long as they provide unique goods that can be unearthed and brought back home, also called exoticism. As an example, the player might feel incentivized to conquer Brazil's territory, so she would no longer have to rely on their compromising trade offers, but have direct access to oranges and silver. Similar procedures apply to city-states. She might, for example, consider protecting Ur against barbarians, not out of altruism, mind you, but in order to reach allied status with them and then be rewarded with exotic goods that Ur owns, as advertised prominently on their city-state menu. These lopsided relations with city-states reenact an especially colonialist perception whereby the childlike colonized provinces need the protection of the superior colonizers and will gladly submit to them by voluntarily sharing their resources in exchange for said protection. Finally, the way in which cities slowly expand their territory over time is tied to the city's output of culture. Accumulating culture automatically expands your territory for you. The more culture you produce, the quicker you expand. So, the game basically tells you that a nation's cultural values legitimize its claims on the land of the consequently uncultured barbarians. This makes culture not merely a vehicle for the storage of a nation's collective memory, but turns it into a marker of that nation's superiority. Their culture justifies their expansion. So let's look into what even qualifies as culture to the game and how you must acquire it.
They became works of art in museums because Europeans said it's art, you know? It's not from Africa. It was not art. It was meant to disappear.
In order to allow nations the production of culture, Civ 5 provides them with mechanics that basically represent two forms of collective memory: works and wonders. So-called great works are music, literature, and visual arts, while so-called natural, national, and world wonders are basically nemotopes, spaces that carry immense cultural meaning. These can be buildings, institutions, public spaces, and natural formations. Although works and wonders function very differently on a mechanical level, both approaches share a heavy reliance on a narrow definition of high culture that inherently carries with it the denial of broader, or more importantly, non-Western concepts of culture. Great works are produced by great musicians, artists, and writers. Once a great person spawns, they can be used to create exactly one artwork of their respective profession. In order to create these great people, a civilization's cities must contain buildings that consistently add to a sort of genius resource, which spawns a great person every time the bar fills up. This incentivizes early construction of these buildings, such as the Musician's Guild, the Artist's Guild, or the Writer's Guild. Art is therefore tied to guilds, a very institutionalized understanding of the arts, although not exclusively a Western concept. The full imperialist potential of great works actually lies not in the procedures behind their production, but in how they must then be used to actually produce tangible culture that the game acknowledges mechanically. Great works always require a free slot of the respective type in a city's building in order to produce culture. In fact, art cannot even be produced in the first place if there is no way to immediately store it. Civ 5's procedures thus tie art to a very narrow range of modes of presentation, and acknowledge high culture only where it is put on display in clearly marked institutionalized spaces of art. According to the game, music belongs to concert halls and opera houses. The visual arts are confined to cathedrals and galleries, and works of writing are either locked into theaters or buried in a library. This rhetoric measures a civilization's cultural status solely by how many distinct pieces of art it has stored away in designated closed-off areas, preferably in the form of buildings, which manifests the discourse behind, and thus the authority of, museums. The same applies to artifacts, which can be found at so-called antiquity sites.
There's more of this shit!
Because artifacts can only be unearthed when the nation that owns the site has a free slot in a museum, the game can generate situations where the player feels more entitled to an archaeological site than the nation that owns it. If all artifacts belong in museums, and you have an artifact but no museums of the kind that I expect, this tells me that I would be justified in just taking your artifact because you clearly have no use for it.
I think that at the moment Africa lacks the structure. These objects must not be exposed to parasites. You have to have staff who can handle, clean and repair the items if need be, and also staff who can display them and put them in a place. And at this time, this just does not exist in Africa.
In the game, museums even feature a so-called theming bonus, which promises additional production of culture if the traits of the stored works conform to predefined narratives. All songs, paintings, and texts are attributed an era and a country of origin, and a theming bonus might, for example, ask for 3 paintings from the Renaissance era, but from 3 different countries. In order to achieve this, civilizations can trade in their works against those of other nations. This means that the game goes out of its way to recreate a museum's dependency on dominant narratives. Quote, "The significance of differences in material culture can only be seen if one is already implicated in a discourse that applies an evolutionary schema in which these objects can be used as proof of the discourse." So, real-world museums can only arrange objects as evidence of already existing conceptions, and are therefore motivated to only exhibit those objects that already adhere to an established narrative. Likewise, Civ 5's theming bonuses represent predetermined discourses that yield more meaning and thus culture when fulfilled. If no theming bonuses require Ethiopian artworks or artifacts, for example, the player is incentivized not to make the Ethiopian culture visible in her museums, concert halls, or libraries. As a result, the mechanics around great works do little to subvert the imperialist role museums have held throughout history. The strict dependency on a specific mode of presentation and interpretation claims Western authority over artifacts and artworks, as they cannot be used to create meaning in any way other than through institutionalized exhibition. Compared to great works, wonders provide a more significant boost to culture production, but usually alongside the production of other resources. Some accelerate the production of great people, some yield gold, some grant a science boost. The direct and indirect culture boost most wonders provide is so significant that their construction is vital to the pursuit of accumulating culture, and basically essential for cultural victory. However, due to how wonders produce resources, Civ 5 marks their cultural significance as inherent to the building, rather than the collective memory interpreted into it. This is because, unlike, for example, artifacts, which hark back to actual battles fought during a match, Civ 5's wonders hold no memory to the in-game past. Usually, in the real world, culturally marked events lead up to the construction of a new or reinterpretation of an existing monument or place. But the construction of Civ 5's wonders precedes their meaning. This turns the originally causal relationship into a utilitarian one. In the game, a civilization does not construct or interpret wonders looking back in order to commemorate historical events, but it does so looking forward, with the intent to create a historical impact on their global standing in the future. For example, the construction of the real Notre Dame is an indicator of the already deeply religious civilization that built it, whereas in the game, the player builds Notre Dame in order to make her civilization more religious. Keep this in mind, I'll come back to it at the end. Because Civ 5 naturalizes this idea of meaning being tied to a place rather than its people, natural wonders like mountains, lakes, and volcanoes must follow the same logic. These are of course not constructed, and could therefore only become meaningful through interpretation, which would tie their meaning to the people that did the interpreting rather than the place. However, this would admit that cultural memory is necessary to project meaning onto an otherwise meaningless object, which is why Civ 5 constructs the exact opposite. It engraves the meaning into the object regardless of who occupies it. If, for example, France incorporates Mount Fuji into their territory and work it, it yields the respective city, say Orléans, 3 culture, 3 faith, and 2 gold. Notice how the French have no choice but to regard Mount Fuji as a religious site, considering its output of faith. Even if they have not adopted the Shinto religion and instead practice Catholicism, Mount Fuji will inevitably produce faith. More importantly, it will do so forever, seemingly immune to shifts in the French culture. Even if they were to adopt a purely secular mindset, they could not subsequently reinterpret this wonder's meaning, since the rules forbid them to. According to the game, Mount Fuji was not interpreted as holding religious value, it simply holds it by nature. The procedures behind wonders therefore manifest an ideology by which someone's perception of an object's cultural meaning is not understood as the result of their own culture, but as inherent to the object, an idea that naturalizes one's own ideology and understands it as universal truth, while all other understandings are rendered false. Such ideology is capable of not only justifying virtually any claim over a foreign place or thing, but also forging a belief in an eternally consistent cultural identity, never to be challenged from within. The combined rhetoric behind works and wonders paints an understanding of culture that is not broad and outside of anyone's control, but extremely narrow and, most importantly, directed. This makes culture not a dynamically emerging force, but, again, an asset of power, a tool. It is, by all means of its surrounding rules and mechanics, presented as a natural resource used to support an empire's agenda, with complex systems regarding its acquisition, but always as a material entity that can be possessed, contained, and controlled.
We're not a team, this is a competition.
Civilization 5 is built on the assumption that only one nation will eventually rule all others by meeting one of 4 victory conditions. Because, as we've just learned, culture carries power, the game provides 3 avenues for a technically non-violent victory. At the forefront, of course, stands the cultural victory path, relying heavily on trade and diplomacy. The diplomatic and science victories are more opportunistic offshoots, while the domination victory constantly looms over everything, and represents the ultimate escalation that every nation may resort to, regardless of their initial strategy. Of particular interest for us, however, concerning all of these paths, is their shared motivation of nationalism and the strategies that support it, in particular isolationism. All of which can be traced back to that original setup, whereby one single civilization must eventually be crowned world champion. All of Civ 5's victories, except the cultural one, ensue a certain economic focus that will always yield some profit regardless, even if strategies are shifted later on. The pursuit of a domination victory yields cities and a powerful military. A science victory motivates quick research of as many game-changing technologies as possible, and the strategies leading up to a diplomatic victory grant not only UN seats and thus power over the economic fate of the world, but also allied status with plenty of city-states, who provide frequent gifts, are reliable trade partners, and allow access to even more luxury resources, and de facto control over more territory. By contrast, pursuing a cultural victory in Civ 5 means to go against the grain, and to embrace decisions that would otherwise be considered unwise. Not necessarily because they harm one's own culture, but because they aid a competing one, and could thus cause more harm than good in the long run. However, this congenial attitude is little more than an elaborate confidence trick. Since there is only one winner, even the support of alliances, peace, and equality must still inevitably lead up to a point where one partner of a bilateral agreement is declared the loser, and thus permanently defeated.
What? You traitorous piece of shit. Okay. Oh, it's on now. Sejong, what are you doing? You don't have any siege weapons.
Defending against a hostile cultural victory is thus turned into a game of constant suspicion, as it makes the player second-guess even the most harmless and inviting foreign proposals. On the flip side, if the player follows the cultural path herself, and her strategies start showing results or become too blatant, allied AI-controlled civilizations may turn, call her out, shut down all relations, and some may even declare war. Pursuing cultural victory is therefore warped into a game of red light, green light, where the player can be harshly punished for pushing her unifying agenda too openly or quickly. The following shall describe how the seemingly innocent procedures behind embassies, open borders, and trade, all of which are imperative to cultural victory, operate on deeply hierarchical assumptions that you can only really call peaceful if you consider the Cold War a time of peace. I'm going to go into a lot of detail here to outline just how absurd all of this is. In order to start accumulating cultural influence over another nation, a civilization must have met and established diplomatic contact with the nation in question. From the moment of first contact onward, then, civilizations may propose establishing embassies in each other's capitals. This sounds like a commitment to peaceful future relations, but it also allows the appointment of diplomats that accelerate cultural influence over the other by 25%. On the flip side, it lays the position of one's own capital bare, not just for hostile military efforts, but also for enemy spies attempting to steal technologies. Civilizations with foreign embassies are thus encouraged to place a spy of their own in their own capital in order to increase their chances of intercepting infiltrators.
Magnificent!
This entire confusing rhetoric surrounding embassies, diplomats, and spies instigates a constant fear of infiltration and mistrust towards diplomacy as a whole, even from the perspective of the nation pursuing cultural victory, as diplomats do not just serve a political function, they are portrayed by the game's rules as foreign agents spreading enemy propaganda among the public. Once embassies have been established, an agreement can be made to establish open borders and allow for the free passage of foreign units, both civil and military. Open borders add another 25% toward the acceleration of cultural influence and facilitate further cultural strategies. Those include the sending of great musicians into a nation's territory to perform influence-boosting concerts, as well as missionaries to more effectively convert a neighbor to one's own religion, which adds yet another 25%. However, mutual agreements also open up one's own borders to foreign actions of the same nature, or to civilizations with the pursuit to map out your territory and city positioning in order to plan troop movements for an eventual invasion. Also, the AI understands the risks that come with these treaties and will issue diplomatic warnings when foreign musicians or missionaries perform actions within their borders. In the case of major distrust towards a civilization's declared motives, the rhetoric would therefore suggest to outright decline the open borders proposition, which effectively teaches the nationalist upholding of strict borders, and the idea that the cultural contamination risks of globalization far outweigh its benefits. Lastly, trade routes to another nation also result in yet another 25% acceleration of cultural influence over them. However, trade routes with foreign cities of different technological progress and with a different majority religion may actually do more harm than good in the pursuit of victory. A less technologically developed nation will gain a scientific boost through foreign caravans from nations with superior research. Trade also amplifies religious pressure between the cities involved and can actually be used to target specific cities for conversion. This means that if the target country of a caravan would receive too high of a science boost, or if one's own city would suffer from too much foreign religious pressure, a trade route might be dismissed as too advantageous for the opposition. Now, on the one hand, these rules acknowledge that no material exchange between cultures happens without an exchange of ideology and knowledge, which is true. On the other, this very observation is presented as undesirable. Science must be protected from pouring out, while religion must be prevented from pouring in, framing trade as an inherently grave risk to a nation's cultural integrity. Progress towards cultural victory therefore puts the player into the role not of a unifying force for good, but of a con artist, a manipulator that springs the trap on her opponent when it is already too late to resist. From the opposite perspective, defending against cultural victory forces the player to indulge in extreme xenophobia, to defend her people against the tidal wave of globalization. Suddenly, the religious pressure from trade routes with other civilizations marks a looming foreign takeover, puppeteered by evil outside forces who literally try to erase your culture. Anticipating this mentality, Civ 5 has a whole host of mechanics in store, right out of the toolbox of isolationism. Sever all diplomatic ties with the nation in question, end trade routes, throw out diplomats, close your borders to foreign civilians, whatever it takes to keep your nation pure and safe from cultural dilution.
A total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the
Zulu Kingdom
until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
The procedures behind the science victory display a similar rhetoric, mostly because the same isolationist cause is rewarded. Science is not portrayed as a neutral joint effort across borders, but as a tool subject to an agenda that is all about borders. It either delivers material superiority or proves cultural superiority. In the game, this teleological mindset permeates the entire existence behind the technology tree. Science is not simply let loose to study nature and culture with the hope of happening across some globally useful findings. No, instead research is directed for the national benefit towards specific technologies that the civilization chooses before research can even commence. This nationalism behind science then justifies espionage, where the AI's universal and frequent use of spies to steal technologies with absolutely no regard for long-standing profitable relations breaks any trust in the genuineness of diplomacy. Every civilization appears to be on its own, and diplomacy becomes just a mask behind which foul play is acted out. As a result, diplomatic victory also has little to do with actual diplomacy, which is largely owed to the fact that the AI is aware of the victory conditions and would never allow them to be fulfilled for a foreign nation under any circumstances. This effectively renders alliances between civilizations useless when it comes to electing a world leader, as everyone will persistently vote for themselves. Civilizations aiming to win a majority must instead turn to city-states, which can be seized by fulfilling quests, possibly the most imperialist of which is longing to be converted by a specific foreign religion, an obvious romanticization of Western missionary work by fabricating consent. Furthermore, affiliation can be bought through rather large amounts of gold, so-called gifts, the costliest but also quickest path to success. Here, the player is incentivized to embrace procedures of corruption as a valid and perfectly normal approach to politics, where you can just buy elections. Lastly, spies can be sent to city-states in order to either rig their elections or attempt a coup, offering high rewards for comparatively low risks. All of these procedures paint democracy as a system that must be exploited in order to ensure public approval of a democratic vote to end democracy itself and institute an autocracy, a world leader. This emphasis on the fragility of democracy extends to the UN as a whole. Its power is not a unifying one, but is instead used to strong-arm political opponents through crippling resolutions. Quote, "The UN in Civilization V is a mockery of the actual international body. There can be no peace settlements through UN channels, and certainly no human rights declaration. The UN functions as a narrative facade, obscuring one method to declare a single individual the winner." Whether diplomacy, trade, or tourism, all of Civ 5's non-violent international affairs revolve around gaining power over others and acting upon this sense of superiority. Any form of relation with another country is based on the mutual understanding that both partners assume to come out of the agreement as the winner. Even a national issue like science feeds into this concept precisely because it is not portrayed as an international affair. As a result, non-violent relations are doused in the rhetoric of nationalism and exploitation of the other, with the overarching concept that no two cultures can peacefully coexist, let alone merge or even unite. The constant struggle for national purity does not allow for a third, shared identity, which is why all international dealings inevitably become acts of aggression, even without resorting to military action. However, war and conquest remain Civ 5's ultimate means of expressing power, as represented by the final X in the 4X strategy genre. Not only does the game's advertising position these mechanics front and center, but their presence constantly looms over even the most peaceful matches. The systems and strategies behind war and military therefore give insight into the procedures behind the game's core premise, around which all other features are constructed. Unlike cultural victory, with tourism and culture as separate values, domination victory does not distinguish between the means of defense and offense. If the player is able to successfully defend her culture, she also has the means to achieve world domination herself. And because military force offers the most direct path to claiming power, even those nations not willing to participate in wars have to invest in defending against a potential threat nonetheless. The resulting arms race leaves most nations capable of military aggression, which they will act upon if they sense an opening. Peace in Civ 5's late game is never a mutual agreement, but the result of clear military dominance that threatens the AI into submission. If the player shows military weakness, even some of the most peaceful nations will resort to violence if they detect a cultural takeover. The game's mechanics of domination therefore ultimately echo the narrative of ultranationalism, whereby the history of the world is that of, well, domination, that must culminate in one nation erasing all its competitors, lest it be erased itself. A literal zero-sum game.
History is often a zero-sum game. History is often about subordination and domination.
In order to help the player overcome her moral inhibitions, the game operates, not only in regard to its economy but also its military, on what Hayes calls a macro scale. This means that it elevates the level of abstraction to a point where individual humans, such as single soldiers, are no longer relevant. Since all military movement is tied to the map's hexagonal tiles, even battles appear and thus become clean and sterile, and provide oversight that paints war as an orderly, easily graspable affair. This is only helped by the turn-based system, stripping battles of all urgency. The player has unlimited time to analyze the situation and ponder her next move, turning war from chaotic slaughter into a battle of wits akin to postal chess. Omnipresent military threat and dehumanizing visuals combine to justify extermination. Now, by legitimizing and rewarding the violent path to victory, the game defines world domination as every culture's final goal in the history of the world, and this is important, must therefore extend the formula to all non-violent interactions as well. It is precisely because domination victory must inevitably end with the demise of all other nations, and because all victories must be equal in value, that all victories have to adopt the winner-takes-all philosophy. At the heart of Civ 5 sits a basic premise. The player chooses one out of a diverse range of unique civilizations to compete against other civilizations. And indeed, some researchers identify a Eurocentrist spin in how the game forces civilizations into a strict Western corset that paints every civilization as small deviations from the supposed Western norm. Ford, for example, bemoans the only minor deviations from a Western prototype that merely exist to offer the player a strategic choice in her own ambitions. The player does not choose the Egyptians to role-play as the Egyptians and follow their ambitions, but because she wants to build wonders and just picks the most effective civ for that purpose. What he fails to infer, however, is that these unique features then also determine a culture's ambitions by nudging the player towards them. Yes, a player eager to construct wonders would only choose Egypt to build them faster, but on the flip side, this also means that when choosing a civilization, their inborn features impose a certain playstyle onto the player. The game ascribes to the Egyptians an expertise in architecture somehow inherent to the culture that then indirectly manifests as a player's ambition, which is then projected back onto the culture. Egyptians are good at building wonders, therefore the most efficient playstyle involves focusing on the construction of wonders, therefore Egyptians usually have the ambition to build wonders. But this then begs the question as to why the Egyptians are sophisticated architects in the first place, why the Japanese are maritime, the Mongols warlike, and the Germans industrious, as Schaefer puts it. Now, from the perspective of the surface design, the reason seems obvious. The rules are simply manifestations of Western stereotypes commonly associated with these cultures.
Precision German engineering.
Ford's criticism of the cultural similarities and his call for even greater hard-coded variety are understandable results of this perspective. It would basically counter the Eurocentrist core of these stereotypes. However, from a mechanical perspective, we can see obvious flaws with this line of argument. When all civilizations start the match with their original settler unit, these people stand at a fictional starting point of progress, with no past history to draw from, and therefore no tradition. They also display a complete ignorance of even the most basic technology, let alone possess any sophisticated societal structures. They cannot possibly be colonizers from a far land, not only because they lack knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation, but most importantly because the world map is implied to represent the entire globe, leaving no room for a hypothetically highly developed motherland from which these tribes could have come. It is in fact a miracle, and ideologically charged game design, that these settlers share an unbreakable sense of group identity to begin with. National identity often relies upon a shared history as ground for both commonality and defining characteristics of the people. But somehow, these groups of people, standing at the beginning of history, already feel united through a shared history from a non-existent past. The situation becomes even more absurd when these groups not only stand united, but also claim these shared, seemingly innate, unique abilities and preferences regarding technologies with which they have never made contact. At the start of a match, the Egyptians are inherently fast builders, even though they have not built anything yet, let alone sheer wonders of architecture. The Japanese gain extra culture from fishing boats and atolls, even though they have never before lived near a river or a lake, let alone sailed the sea. Meanwhile, the Mongols sport an inherent military talent, boosting their soldiers' strength in battle, and giving their horsemen faster movement, even when they do not own any military and have yet to fight their first battle or even tame their first horse. This predetermined essential identity, thrown into a historical context before said identity would even have been possible, is the paradox usually found in the narratives propping up tradition. Traditions reinforce the idea that national identity can be passed down over generations, as though it were some precious essence. We should therefore ultimately not focus on the fact that, for example, the Zulu resemble the English far too closely, as Ford does, but that at the start of a match, they differ from them at all, out of seemingly nowhere. According to the game, cultures contain their unique traits from the beginning of time, and will do so until they either perish or win over the other, likewise clearly demarcated cultures. Krang emphasizes that the idea of culture as a container places a premium on purity within cultures, as an essence that is handed down, and on boundaries between cultures, maintaining this. This means that this mythical cultural identity is used to tell cultures apart and facilitate eternal conflict between them. Because, since these cultural differences are set in stone, so are their conflicts. But the supposedly inborn traits of civilizations also provide them with a manifest destiny that can justify basically any imperialist claim. Like, because the Egyptians are the builders of wonders, they carry an inherent privilege to hold the majority of world wonders, and authority to rob other countries of the opportunity to build them themselves. The Japanese have the right to occupy coastal areas before anyone else, because by comparison, all other cultures are woefully ineffective at utilizing the sea. Lastly, the Mongols should embrace their own lust for war, as it is in their nature to rain terror on those that oppose them. And on the flip side, the Germans can easily cast aside any plans for diplomatic relations with Mongolia, as its people are, by nature, warmongering savages. Therefore, ethical considerations would be out of place in dealing with them, and no mercy must be shown until their kind is annihilated. It is in their essence, always has been, and always will be. This last example in particular shows the rhetoric at work even when there is not yet any tangible sign of the trait in question. If the player realizes that her closest neighbor is Mongolian, she would be heavily advised to invest in a powerful military to defend her cities against the inevitable invasion, and deny Genghis Khan any and all diplomatic interactions, especially embassies or open border treaties. All of this would be acted out on the mere premise that the Mongolians are Mongolians, not on any signs of actual aggression. Their Mongolian essence, however, convinces its AI to inevitably follow the domination victory path more often than not, and will provide it with the necessary advantages to achieve it, unless precautions are taken by their neighbors before the first incident even occurs, thus legitimizing prejudice and xenophobia.
Alright, while we have sex, just think really hard about machine guns.
As I'm sure you've noticed throughout this video, I have repeatedly argued that most of the game's imperialist rhetoric is owed to the fact that mechanics, rules, and goals have been put in place to maximize player agency, and thus inevitably equate attributes of the player element to the attributes of an entire culture. As a nation is represented by a single human player, so is its unity, consistency, process of decision-making, memory, and, most importantly, purpose. One of the most obvious examples are the procedures behind acquiring an ideology. Once our civilization enters the modern era, the player can choose an ideology for her culture. Now, in reality, of course, ideology is not chosen after everyone collectively agreed that society had somehow entered a new era out of nowhere. No, instead, the economic conditions of that society foster an ideology that best reflects them, which then heralds the arrival of a new era. There can be no ideology without prior economic conditions that affect the people who then create and uphold it. So in the game, ideologies do not dynamically emerge out of socio-economic conditions, but because the society as a whole sets a goal first and then chooses the ideology best fit for purpose. The game essentially confuses the two possible answers to the question of why. Why did the Germans take on the ideology of autocracy? Is it because of the collective trauma of starting and losing a world war, and with it the undeserved national pride, crippling reparations on top of a global recession, preventing an economic recovery, a failed experiment in democracy, and an easily fabricated narrative of treason blaming a centuries-old scapegoat? Or is it for the purpose of strengthening their military? Now, the latter is wrong, I hope I don't have to explain that, but it comes with a purpose, which a game can easily translate into player agency, while the former might as well just be a simulation that you can watch but not really partake in. The civilization would still progress, develop, and adapt, but do so dynamically, without requiring any top-down decisions, making the player effectively redundant. But without interactivity, the game would defy the very definition of the medium. It would no longer qualify as a game. This creates a dilemma whereby the medium itself forbids the communication of a certain idea, or in the words of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Gameplay always presents the player with goals and mechanics to achieve these goals. This provides the player with a purpose. Since the player is inherently an element of every game, no game therefore escapes the concept of purpose. All a game can do is diminish this concept into meaninglessness by erasing any major goals or any complex mechanics, or even both. Gameplay inevitably forces purpose into the rhetoric of a game, even if the narrative presents a situation where no actual purpose exists. This phenomenon I call the designed evolution dilemma. It results from a player assuming the role of an entity whose complexity exceeds the decision-making of an individual, like a town or even an entire species. The complex non-human role of the player matched with the human decision-making results in the player's decisions representing phenomena that are precisely not that, unanimous decisions, but the outcomes that evolved from the dynamic interactions within the system, like society or nature, which are actually devoid of any overarching design or guidance. In Civ 5, this situation arises when the player, as an individual, represents a collective, a relation that inherently reproduces discourses of essentialism, teleology, and nationalism, as it gives a people one voice, one will, one power. The player's civilization must be portrayed as an undivided hive mind, forming a logic by which traditions and events did not come about as the effects of complex interactions, but because everyone collectively decided it be so. The entire premise of Civ 5, the player choosing a culture over which to take control, sets up the game on a deeply imperialist foundation, because the game's premise triggers the designed evolution dilemma, and imbues every single game mechanic with an imperialist spin. If your entire outlook on history is that cultures function like single people, more importantly, people engaged in an eternal competition, then no matter how respectfully you portray them, everything you say about them will carry that imperialist sentiment. There's just no escaping that. Civilization V's rhetoric operates on two levels: the narrative design on its surface and that of its underlying mechanical procedures. Both contribute to the game's overarching imperialist narrative, but use different methods to achieve this. On the surface, the imperialism is actually rather subtle, if you're not looking for it. However, once you do, it is practically everywhere. The game simply cannot shake its Western heritage, which largely informs what it considers to be the prototype culture, and the extremely narrow Overton window of what the game thinks a culture or civilization can even look like. That same Western default is also responsible for the shallow pool of historical references from which the game draws its civilizations, leaders, and wonders. Even the concepts and designs of units, the map, and even time itself are lifted straight from uniquely European history and mythology, but are then assumed to apply to all cultures universally. From a mechanical perspective, this portrayal of the West as the norm establishes one out of many historical paths as the only one indicative of real progress, and deeming all other paths inherently inferior. However, the main culprit of Civ 5's imperialism lies in how its mechanics naturalize an imperialist understanding of how nations function and interact with one another, namely as single, eternally unified entities that naturally compete for land, resources, and power, with the express purpose of subjugating the rest of the world to their rule. Make no mistake, that is how civilization defines the purpose of cultures. The fact that in the process of doing so, the player must act out some very specific colonial strategies is just the icing on the cake. The interactivity of the medium forces an imperialist baseline onto the game, and the game design actively leans into it when it really doesn't have to. This is evidenced by the fact that Civ 5's successor, Civilization 6, reenacts the very same premise, but does away with many of the contentious points discussed in the video, proving that, yes, you can design it differently. We could learn a lot from analyzing how new features like city districts, governors, and the loyalty system subvert the narrative of essentialism, or how the introduction of Dark Ages as the opposite of Golden Ages break with the meta-narrative of progress that dominates its predecessor. Where Civ 5 was all about national unity, Civ 6 introduces disparity and revolt, and while Civ 5 was all rise, Civ 6 is rise and fall. This even extends to visual changes, as for example with how the new map no longer portrays unexplored land as black and clouded, how leader screens completely ditched backgrounds for all leaders, or how the same unit types now differ in their portrayal between cultures. And yet, we already know that none of this is enough to deny the imperialist foundation of the game's premise. So what better words to go out on than those of Cree headman Milton Tootoosis commenting on the inclusion of his Poundmaker Cree nation into Civ 6. Civilization perpetuates this myth that First Nations had similar values that the colonial culture has, and that is one of conquering other peoples and accessing their land. That is totally not in concert with our traditional ways and worldview. Now, how do I transition from this to the overly happy credits song that I recall? Thank you so much for watching. If you really made it this far, Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm aware that post-colonial analysis of civilization is sort of a joke at this point, because it's just so obvious, and I almost feel pretentious for pointing it out, but here it is. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, the easiest way to support us is always to leave a like, or maybe even a comment, to appease the almighty algorithm. Have a good one.
Would you be interested in a trade agreement with England?